Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Brownfield Grantwriting Training Webinar Series, Kickstart Your Application, hosted by the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. Today, we'll be presenting Webinar 4, Task Descriptions, Cost Estimates, and Measuring Progress. I'm Scott Nightingale with KSU TAB, and I'll be moderating today's session. We would like to thank the Louisiana Municipal Advisory and Technical Services Bureau, LMATS, for sponsoring this webinar series and helping us reach municipalities across Louisiana. During today's event, we will be muting everyone except for the speakers. However, just as a precaution, please go ahead and mute yourself individually as well. If you'd like to ask a question at any time during this webinar, please do so by using the group chat box. Just type in your questions. We will stop periodically during the webinar to answer them. The slides from this presentation, along with a recording of the meeting, will be available on the KSU TAB website. It's important if you're using your phone for the audio connection that you turn off your computer audio. Otherwise, there might be some feedback that gets through the system for everyone to hear. Audio settings in Zoom can be set by clicking the up arrow adjacent to the mute button, as Rebecca is showing you there. Also, please note the chat button near the bottom right. This will open the chat box where you can ask questions or see what other people have asked.
Now, of course, I got to figure out how to get out of this. There we go. Uh-oh. All right, you're good, Scott.
Our speakers this afternoon are Rebecca Oddie and Amanda Aylwine. Rebecca is the Brownfield Coordinator at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. She has successfully written several Brownfield Assessment Grant applications, as well as some unsuccessful ones, gathering a list of lessons learned and grant writing insights. Amanda Aylwine is a Senior Planner for the City of Oklahoma City in the Community Development Division of the Planning Department. She manages the Brownfields Program and the COVID Relief CDBG Grant Program for nonprofit organizations. She has worked in brownfields for over 11 years and managed 4 EPA revolving loan funds, 3 site-specific cleanup grants, and 9 assessment grants. Like Rebecca, Amanda has written many successful grant applications and many unsuccessful ones. We'd like to thank her for taking time today to share her knowledge and experience. Rebecca, please go ahead and get us started.
All right. All right, so today we're going to start this one off with a poll question, get some feedback from y'all. Now that we're a little bit further in the webinar series, I think when we did this poll at the beginning, about half the people knew what kind of grant they were applying for. So we're just going to check in again to see if you have any more specificity on what you're planning on applying for. So there's the assessment community-wide, applying for that by yourself. Applying for a brownfield assessment grant, a site-specific one, applying for a coalition assessment grant, a multi-purpose grant, a cleanup grant, or you're still not sure yet, which is perfectly fine. We still have plenty of time. So if you can go ahead and select which one you're going to apply for, and then just go ahead and hit the submit button.
We still have a few votes trickling in, so we'll leave it open for a few more seconds. All right, that concludes that, and here's the results.
All right, looks good. So we've got a few people that are going for just the regular community-wide assessment grant. Someone's going to apply for a site-specific assessment grant. We've got quite a few going for a coalition assessment grant. That's great. Somebody's going to take on a multi-purpose grant. That is wonderful. We'd like to see one of those in Louisiana, as well as a cleanup grant. That would be great to get more cleanup funding in the state. And then a few people who aren't sure yet. And like I said, we're still very early, so that's perfectly all right. All right, let's see. There we go. All right, so welcome to the fourth webinar in our Brownfield Grant Writing Training webinar series. As Scott mentioned, we're going to go over task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. Just as a reminder, like we do every time, these webinars are based on the previous year's Brownfield request for applications. So the new request for applications is expected to be issued in late August and might have some changes to it that we're going to go over in the final webinar in the series. And actually, Amanda today has an example of how things have changed since she last applied for Brownfield funding that she's going to note during our webinar today. So here's the outline of what we're going to cover. We'll start with describing the specific tasks and activities that you plan to undertake with this funding, including your anticipated schedule for those activities, who's taking the lead, and what outputs that you're going to actually submit to document your accomplishments, which is also known as your deliverables. We're then going to cover how to develop your cost estimates and your budget for the wonderful work that you're going to accomplish with this grant funding. And then we're going to finish off with how to measure the environmental results of your program to report back to EPA on your successes and accomplishments. And that provides EPA with the data they need to document all the great things that the Brownfield program is doing and basically why Congress should continue to fund it. So very important on that. I'm very glad that we have Amanda with us today. She's a prolific grant writer for Oklahoma City. And she's really going to add in some great suggestions about her approach to writing each of the sections that we're going to go over today. So Amanda, would you like to talk about your overall approach to writing a Brownfield grant proposals in general with kind of this section as an example?
Sure. Okay, so I've been doing this for about 10 years, and one of the key things is writing your standout application is to make it easy on your reviewers. In talking with our reviewers, each reviewer reviews around a dozen applications. And so what is going to make your application stand out between the other, 8 to 12 that they're reviewing? So what you really want to do is you want to make your application, you want to make it easy to read. You want it to make it easy to score and easy to understand. So I suggest that you follow the outline, and I always identify the points associated with it. That's just something that I do, but definitely follow the outline, because if you address something and it's not in the section where the points are allocated, you won't get the points. Just for example, and this is the description of tasks and activities and outputs, there's a total of 25 points. Those points will come under, those points are delivered, like 10 points are credited for project implementation. 5 points are anticipated project schedule. 5 points are task activity leads, and 5 points are for outputs. So you need to make sure in your chart or in your application that you have addressed each of these specifically, because that's where you get your points from.
Great, thank you, Amanda. All right, let's do. All right, so let's start off with your description of tasks, activities, and their related outputs. So keep in mind as we go through this section is talking about what you're specifically going to do with this funding. So now we're going to talk about what's your plan for this funding that you're applying for. So EPA recommends using this table format. It makes it easy for the EPA reviewer to find all the information they're looking for. And it also makes it easy for you to clearly lay out your anticipated tasks and activities. So you'll want to group your activities in a way that flows well with your application. And as with the rest of the application that we keep talking about, helps you tell your story. So in the header, you're going to give a name to your task. Like, for example, task 1, outreach to the priority sites community. Then you're going to talk about the actual task activities you're going to conduct with this funding. EPA also wants to know what's your timeline, what's your plan for ensuring the funding is fully utilized within the 3-year project period. Then you'll note a lead for each task. All right, let's admit it. We've all been in those meetings where everybody has agreed on a plan of action at the end of the meeting, but no one was actually assigned to be the lead for follow through. Let's be honest, not a whole lot gets accomplished after that meeting in most cases. EPA has been in those meetings too, and I'm guessing they have managed a few grants where the proposal looked great, but when it came time for implementation, there was no one really assigned to implement that plan. So they want to know who or at least what entity is specifically responsible for ensuring that task gets done. And then finally, you're going to include your outputs for each task. Basically, these are the deliverables that you're going to submit to EPA to actually document that the work you described was really accomplished. So as we've mentioned before, if EPA provides an example table, I highly recommend that you use it. It makes it easier for the reviewer. Keep in mind, again, they're reviewing somewhere around 12 applications. So the easier that they can find the information, the more likely you can get the points that you deserve. One note about this recommended table format was new as of last year. So if you've been looking at the previous grant proposals on KSU's website from 2018, it's not set up this way. But just as an FYI, we checked today and KSU's website does have some sample proposals from last year, so they should have this table format in there. And if you kind of look back at the ones from 2018, I think you'll kind of understand why EPA went through this table format. It just makes it much easier for them to review it and make sure all the information is there for each specific task. So the first part of section A is project implementation. So this is where you'll describe the tasks and activities that you'll undertake using this funding to address your community's issues and create the utopia that you talked about earlier in the application. Okay, so looking through the guidance, I didn't really think it's super clear on defining what's a task versus an activity. It kind of lumps them together. But the budget table has columns. The column headers are for tasks. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to refer to tasks as the main header for each grouping of related activities. Hopefully that'll make sense as we go through this. Also, some of the activities we're going to talk about are specific to brownfields, and I will admit sometimes we get into like brownfield jargon that not everybody understands. So if we use a term or an acronym that you don't happen to know, please type it into the chat box, and we'll cover any of those that aren't explained on the slides during the Q&A at the end of this section. So Amanda, would you like to go over some helpful tips about the budget?
Sure. So this budget was pulled directly out of the RFA from last year's grant application. And so what I wanted to show you here is you can see the budget, but you can see on the top, it says task 1, it says task 2, task 3, task 4. And so as you're writing your grant, when you're describing your tasks in your application, just know that whatever your first task that you describe will then be at the top of this budget, and that's where you'll rename task 1 as whatever your task 1 is. You'll rename task 2 whatever your task 2 is. So I just kind of wanted to point out this correlation between text and budget, or chart and budget, that they interchange.
Yeah, you want to make sure everything matches up in this section. All right. So let's talk about what EPA is asking for. First, under project implementation, you're going to talk about the activities you plan to undertake with this funding that relate directly to your priority sites and your target areas. You want to make sure the activities that you list out are eligible. So they're eligible for brownfield grant funding, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They're specific to your proposal, so make sure they relate back to your brownfield sites and the target areas you mentioned before. And they will help you address the issues in the target areas that you talked about earlier. Again, continue that same narrative of telling your story throughout the whole application. So basically, EPA wants to know that you have a plan of action in place so that if you get this funding, you can hit the ground running and be able to start on your plan of action right away. Note that the evaluation criteria also mention a sound plan to address priority sites. So, make sure to actually mention your priority sites and your target areas in this section. It also mentions your readiness to achieve the project goals in an efficient manner. So again, are you able to get started and keep moving forward as soon as the grant is awarded? In addition to the work that you're going to be doing in your priority areas, there is an option that you can also include activities outside the target areas. I'm going to be honest, this gets a little fuzzy. You could include things like additional environmental assessments if something happens and you run out of projects in the target area, or maybe outreach to the community at large, if maybe that will help bring in more redevelopment to your target area. Just note that this particular criteria, this is one that's if applicable. So if you can spend all your money in your target area, that's great. You don't have to do anything outside your target area, that's okay. Another one that's if applicable, you can also include task activities that might be contributed by other sources that are necessary to carry out the grant. So examples of this might be if your city is going to pay the salary of your brownfield coordinator to oversee the program, instead of charging their time to the grant, you could include that as an activity. Or if you're going to have a nonprofit donate space for an outreach meeting, that's directly related to the outreach you're going to do with this grant, just make sure it's necessary to execute this specific grant. I'm going to be honest, I would try to keep this at a minimum to simplify things. I wouldn't add something in here just to have it in here. I'd only include activities that EPA would see as necessary to successfully complete the grant, but you're not specifically requesting funding for. As a reminder, remember when we talked about in section 1CI, the resources needed for site reuse. This was like kind of the leveraging resources section. That one said, don't duplicate what you put in section 3AI. So note that anything you put in here as an in-kind resource, like the city donating the money for the brownfield coordinator or donated outreach space, anything you put in here shouldn't be included in that section 1CI. So basically you don't double count it. So it's either in here underneath your activities, or it's in the resources needed for site reuse, not in both. All right, and then finally, if you're applying for an assessment coalition grant, the evaluation criteria includes a note that coalitions should assess a minimum of 5 sites with at least 1 site in each coalition member's jurisdiction. So make sure it's really clear in this section how many site assessments you plan to undertake, and note how there are sites in each coalition member's jurisdiction. So if your members have overlapping jurisdictions, make a note of that in this section to show your assessments will be in an area of overlapping jurisdiction if that's the case. Remember, don't assume that the reviewer is going to remember that from a previous section. And then don't, as Amanda mentioned, you want to make sure to put the information in each section where it's asked for to make sure you get the maximum number of points in each section. So most proposals have about 3 or 4 tasks. Some have had more. Scott mentioned one, I think, that had 9. I think that's a little much. Some might have less, but 3 to 4 is kind of a good place to start. So these are some of the general tasks that either I've used or I've seen in other proposals. There's more than 4 obviously on this list. These are just to kind of give you ideas. You can combine some of these together. You might want to separate them out for your proposal, whatever works for your application. So typically I include something called cooperative agreement oversight. Basically, that's taking care of all the strings that come attached to EPA funding and the general grant management. I also include one, I call it, make it fancy and call it exchange program information, which is actually a fancy way of saying travel. So basically, if EPA hosts a brownfield event, they really want you to attend. These are great opportunities to get updated information on the brownfield program, as well as for you to exchange information with other brownfield grantees and with EPA, so you're not reinventing the wheel. And remember, travel costs are an eligible grant expense. And I've actually heard EPA kind of get suspicious if you don't include it, or at least note that you're going to pay for it out of other funding, because they do really want you to come to the brownfield workshops that they host. This is an example. You could combine this with cooperative agreement oversight and make that all one task. It's kind of up to you. Another task I typically have is community engagement. As we've mentioned before, that's a big priority with EPA. So you want to look back on what you talked about in section 2B3 in your community engagement section, and then develop your list of activities from what you said you were going to perform in that section. Brownfields planning, that's the eligible brownfield planning activities that you could also include, like an infrastructure evaluation that we talked about earlier in the webinar, or you could combine this with community engagement. You could put those together. The meat of the application, you don't want to forget about that. Make sure you have a task that includes actually conducting environmental assessments. Personally, I recommend you have this as a standalone task, so you clearly describe the assessment work you plan to complete with this funding. Finally, you can also include a task of cleanup planning if you plan on developing cleanup plans and other related documents to your funding. This can be a standalone task, or you could, combine this with the assessment task. Just as an FYI, the personnel and fringe costs to conduct and oversee these activities are eligible grant expenses. So if you have somebody who is going to help you actually execute this grant, somebody on staff, you can include those as grant expenses. So for instance, when I was at the Regional Planning Commission, my position was totally grant funded. And so it was, we were able to build that into the grant proposal. All right, so now that we've gone over some of the sample tasks, let's talk about some of the activities that would comprise those tasks. So activities under the cooperative agreement oversight include things like the quarterly reports to EPA. That's going to be a grant requirement, so it looks good if you kind of show you're in the know and you know that you're going to have those already and you have a plan for addressing those. Updating acres. This is EPA's assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment exchange system. Basically, it's a database of the assessments and cleanups conducted using EPA brownfield funding, and as well as the outcomes from that funding, like jobs created, leverage funding, acres cleaned up. It's basically the one-stop shop for what have we actually done with this brownfield funding. It's super important to EPA to document the accomplishments of the funding. It helps rationalize to Congress why they should keep allocating money to brownfields. It's also a great tool for grantees to highlight their successes. I use it a lot, if there's an elected official that wants to know what's going on in their area or wants to see the outcomes of this, it's a great resource for that. So I recommend that you mention updating acres at least monthly in your activities. Again, it kind of shows that you're in the know of what's going to be required. Most grantees don't have an in-house environmental consultant that's actually going to do the assessment work. So if you don't have a competitively selected environmental consultant already under contract, you're going to want to note your plan for procuring one. That could be a basic thing underneath your activities, and then later on in the next webinar when we go over programmatic capability, you'll talk more about how you'll select them. You may also want to note your plan for actually drawing down on the grant and tracking the financials. It doesn't have to be extensive, just plan on doing grant drawdowns once a month or once every other month. You just want to let EPA know that you have a plan in place to actually draw down on the grant. If you're awarded funding, you're also going to need to have a quality management plan for your overall program. Don't worry about this too much right now. EPA is going to give you a very user-friendly template to use that's going to outline the procedures that you're going to need to follow. Basically, it's to make sure that the data that you collect using this funding is going to be accurate and defensible. You do need to update this annually. Mostly you send in a letter to EPA just saying there's no changes, or here's the 3 or 4 changes that you made. So I recommend that you mentioned either that you have a quality management plan and you plan to update it annually, or you plan on developing your quality management plan within the first 30, 60 days following the award, and then you'll update it annually, just so that EPA knows you're aware of that requirement. As we said before, exchange program information is basically attending brownfield conferences and grantee calls. The 3 main ones you want to note are the regional meeting in Dallas. That's generally held on an annual basis. The National Brownfield Conference, which is held every roughly 18 to 24 months. Next one's in Oklahoma City next April. Amanda can tell you more about that. And then EPA Region 6 grantee calls. They like to get folks together kind of on a quarterly basis, either with similar grants or within the same geography, to just kind of see how things are going, share EPA updates from headquarters, and basically provide support for programs. So you kind of want to just note that you plan to attend the regional and national meetings and then participate in the EPA grantee calls. As we mentioned before, community engagement, another really great task to highlight. Activities should correspond to what you included in section 2B3 in community engagement. That can include things like community meetings, coordinating Zoom calls, providing site progress updates to the affected community, and coordinating coalition meetings if you're applying as a coalition. This is one that you kind of want to be creative in. If you've got an innovative way of reaching people, be sure to include it here as well as in section 2B3. And just as a note, even though this funding is not going to be available until October of 2021, and hopefully the pandemic is going to be over by then, you may want to address how your community outreach will adapt to your state's requirements for social distancing. I am finding that federal agencies are being very cautious and taking a very conservative approach to the pandemic. EPA, for example, I don't think that they are back in the office yet at all. I think they're all still teleworking. So, and I've heard that with other federal agencies as well. So it's just something you might want to think about, having the ability to have meetings via Zoom or, other ways of communicating with the community remotely, or plans for social distancing. And this is something you might want to look for in the new RFA just to see if they ask about it. Okay, so we talked about eligible brownfield planning activities like enhancing your existing brownfield inventory, conducting reuse planning, evaluating infrastructure needs. We've talked about some of these during our previous webinars. You can include these as a standalone task under brownfield planning, or you can kind of incorporate these into other tasks. Like, for example, reuse planning could also be part of your community engagement task. As a reminder, we also included it in a link in the Next Steps and Helpful Links document to provide more information on what you can include underneath the brownfield planning activities. All right, and again, the meat of the application is actually conducting those environmental assessments. So phase 1 environmental assessments, those are basically the research reports that are going to figure out what are the environmental concerns at your site. And then a phase 2 environmental assessment is where you actually go out and collect soil and groundwater samples to see what's there. So you definitely want to note how many phase ones and how many phase twos you plan to conduct using this funding. And you'll probably figure this number out in coordination with developing your budget because you want to make sure that those correlate together. Under this, you can also include, you could put procuring your environmental consultant in this task, selecting your sites for assessment, either from your priority sites once you actually get the funding, or evaluating additional sites once your priority sites are completed. Securing site access. This is a big thing with EPA. They want to know you have a plan in place to actually access these sites. So it's good to note that you have a plan for it. Submitting the property eligibility determination request to EPA. Before you can spend any of this funding on a site, you do have to get EPA's approval for each site and each phase of the project. So you just want to note that you have a plan for that. Developing quality assurance project plans. These detail out how you're going to collect data at each site to ensure that data quality. So you have a quality management plan for your overall program, and then each site has a quality assurance project plan. You also want to, just note that you have a plan for submitting the assessment reports to EPA, so they have that documentation, as well as keeping EPA informed of the progress. So you could put that underneath your cooperative agreement oversight as well. And then site progress updates to the community. You can either put that underneath this task or you could put it underneath the community engagement. You just kind of want to make sure you're noting that you're keeping the community informed throughout the entire process. Finally, some folks separate out cleanup planning as its own task. This is developing a plan to actually address environmental contamination at the site. This could also include developing an analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, also called an ABCA, which is required if whoever is redeveloping the site plans to use EPA brownfield funding for the cleanup. So it outlines the potential cleanup options, evaluates them on factors like effectiveness and cost, and then recommends a preferred alternative. Personally, I normally lump this in with my assessment task, but some folks separate it out. It just kind of depends on what works best for your application. All right, so just remember, each program is unique. These are just some ideas to help get you started. And as with the rest of the proposal, I really encourage you to read other applications to get ideas on what to include and how to group them to see what's going to work best for your application. Okay, so if you are a local government applicant, you can use up to 10% of the total grant award for health monitoring activities. So the health monitoring activities must be associated with brownfield sites where you're at least doing a phase 2 environmental site assessment and it's contaminated with at least one hazardous substance. You also have to make sure to partner with your local health agency on this. I'm going to be honest with you, I've never used the funding for health monitoring before, but we did include a link to the EPA information on health monitoring activities webpage. So that has some additional information if you're interested in this. That's in the next steps and useful links document. If you plan on including this activity in your work scope, make sure you're coordinating with your local health agency and note that coordination in your application. Local governments can also use grant funding to monitor and enforce institutional controls that are used to prevent human exposure to the hazardous substance from a brownfield site. So an example of an institutional control would be like a conveyance notice that limits what can be built on the site. I'm going to be honest, I'm not aware of any grantees that actually do this, but it is an option, so you might want to think about it either for this application or for something down the road. Just note for both of these activities, the local government applicants may not exceed more than 10% of your total grant funding on these activities. So you want to make sure you're clearly indicating the amount you're allocating for these in your budget to show that it's not more than 10% of the funds. And this is one, if you needed more information about this, I would definitely recommend contacting EPA and seeing if they have additional feedback on how to incorporate this into your program. All right, so as we mentioned before, you should only include activities that are eligible for this grant funding in your table, and each task and activity should clearly relate back to your brownfield program. So here are some of the list of ineligible activities. I'm not going to read through them all because they will also be in the RFA. We just want to make sure to bring these to your attention, that these, you don't want to include any of these in your list of activities. Just note that the last two bullet items, they are actually eligible if you can clearly state how they relate to advancing the cleanup and reuse of brownfields in your target area. But you can't just do general area-wide master planning or general community vision. It really needs to relate back to your brownfield program. These are just a few more of the things that are not eligible. The big things, the one in the middle, you can't use it on Superfund sites. You can't use the funding on properties that are owned by the federal government, or sites that have EPA consent decrees, and there's other requirements for that. You just want to make sure that you're looking through the RFA and clearly note which sites aren't eligible. And if you have a question on that, definitely ask EPA about that. And then also no double dipping. If you're getting grants from another program to do the exact same work, you want to make sure that you're not applying for the same projects or the same type of work in two different grants, or a grant that you already have. All right, so this is an example of how you might start your table. So your task one, we're going to use the example of community outreach. Your description of task activities underneath I is we're going to host quarterly meetings in the target area to inform the community about brownfield sites and site progress and gather their input on the environmental work and planned reuses. You know, we're going to regularly post on social media, including our partners' outlets, to keep the community informed and solicit feedback. And then we're going to conduct semi-annual coalition meetings. So one of the in-kind contributions might be donation of meeting space by XYZ nonprofit, who we've also noted up above as one of our community partners. So that's just kind of an example of how to pull this together. So the next steps for section 3AI, you want to develop a bullet list or a table of your planned activities. You know, what applies to your priority sites or your target areas, what applies for outside of your target area, what are the in-kind resources necessary to complete the scope of work. And then once you kind of have your list of planned activities, I recommend then you group those into 3 or 4 tasks based on what works for you. Another approach is to do these the opposite way, come up with your 3 or 4 tasks, and then outline your activities underneath that. It just kind of depends on what works best for your way of grant writing. Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about how you would approach this?
Sure. And so in our applications, we narrow it down to, I typically narrow it down to 4 tasks. The tasks are ones that I use because this is the program that I do, and your program will be different. But I'll put it under the task of programmatic support, phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. Is that my task 2? My task 3 is use-based cleanup planning, so cleanup planning, and my task 4 is community involvement. So I just want to, we're pretty successful in our grant applications, but those are the 4 that I use. We try to keep it simple. Just to tell you the activities that I include, we'll just go with programmatic support. The things that follow that I describe under programmatic support include cooperative agreement oversight, negotiating our work plan, quarterly reports, education and training, quarterly drawdowns, financial tracking, entering and updating properties into acres, attending EPA Brownfield Quality Assurance Training. Everybody's required to attend that. And then to enter and update properties data into acres. So these are all requirements if you receive the grant that you have to do. And by describing this task of programmatic support, it really shows that I understand what is involved with accepting this grant, these grant funds. So that's what we use. I would say if you're on an existing program, really think through the process that you've gone through and really include those steps. If you are a new program and you've never received brownfield funding before, this is a key because grant applications are available to the public. KSU Tab has some on their website, but look at other programs and see what they've listed so that you understand that these things might be required. But yeah, or just reach out to other programs. What I've learned with brownfields is we're really good about information sharing. If you are new to the program, call an existing grantee up and say, hey, I just want to visit with you. I feel like our community is good about sharing tips and like improving programs. So yeah, reach out to other programs, read other proposals, and make sure you're prepared to negotiate your cooperative agreement, which includes your work plan, your contractor selection, what steps must you take. The city of Oklahoma City, we have a pretty extensive process for hiring contractors. And I go through my public works department and they do the RFP, or they do the RFP, and then it's a panel of people that select. But I have to know that's going to take a month or two. And so you just have to look at your agency, what steps do you have to take, and include that.
All right, great. Thanks, Amanda. All right. So that brings us to the end of the first section. So any questions about tasks and activities to include in your grant application? Any of the eligible activities, anything else you would like to go over in more detail or questions about?
Rebecca.
Yep.
Hi. We had a question come in, and I'm going to unmute Lilith. She wanted some clarification on assessment stuff. So Lilith, I think I got you unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi. So I just wanted to clarify the two sections between the first one where we're requesting funding activities and this section. Why, since all of these things seem very central to the grant, am I misunderstanding that this section of the grant are also funded activities, or why would we put them in this section versus in that first section where we're requesting funding?
Which is the first section that you're talking about?
So we were looking at the slides earlier and you mentioned, I think it was the grant funded activity. You kind of clarified that there were two pieces, but yeah. I think I'm just misunderstanding this because this is like really central. So I'd imagine these are grant funded activities.
Okay. So in part one, where I think it's part one of the application, you're going to talk about your overall program and your leveraged resources. So that's the section one, that what you need to have in place for site reuse. So basically in that specific section, what EPA wants to know is, all right, if EPA gives you this funding to do the environmental assessments, what are the other resources you have in place to make sure it actually gets redeveloped? You know, that's what they want in that section. Versus what they want in this section is, okay, if we give you this funding, what are you going to do with this specific funding?
Perfect. I think I flipped those and was therefore very confused. That helps.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know it's a little confusing because it's separated out to the two. All right, let me go back down. All right, Scott, any other questions?
Yes. Had a question from Trey Hess. Is a recap evaluation considered part of an assessment activity?
Yes. So a recap of investigation, that's LDEQ's Risk Evaluation and Corrective Action Program. So basically there are different categories of doing a phase 2 environmental site assessment of a site where you actually go out and collect soil and groundwater samples. So you can do a phase 2 basic one is you're just collecting a few soil and groundwater samples to see if maybe there's an issue. And then if you do find that there's an issue that it exceeds the LDEQ standards, then you need to do a recap evaluation, which is much more prescriptive. There's a specific process for that in order to assess what's there, determine the nature and extent of the site, and do all that. Honestly, you can group it all for purposes of the grant application. You can call them all phase 1 assessments. EPA doesn't really differentiate those out. I, for years, called recap evaluations phase 2s. So I think for purposes of the grant, you can just call them all phase 2 environmental site assessments.
But they don't go with the cleanup planning, they actually go with the assessment.
They are, the recap investigation is part of the assessment part of the project. And if Jen and Dwayne are on and want to correct me, you can. Those are the assessment folks that are the experts at DEQ for the Brownfield program.
I had another question regarding the number of tasks. I've heard that if you keep it to 4 or less, somehow this makes it easier with, is it the grants.gov site that kind of limits the way you enter stuff and the tasks are better to keep a smaller number? Or am I getting that confused or something?
Amanda, do you know about that?
I'll just jump in and say, just keep it as simple as you can. The more tasks you involve, the more complicated it gets. So if you can merge some tasks, then like I said, I suggest when you're limited on space in your application. So if you can merge them and come up with if you can come up with a task description that's more inclusive, I would suggest that just for spacing. Mm-hmm. They ask a lot of information and only give you a little bit of space to describe your project. So if you can, you'll find, I always go over my page limit and I'm always looking for ways to combine. But when you write your grant application and you have these tasks, these will then translate into your work plan. But yes, like I said, if you can keep them, you can keep it simple. Definitely, I would say it's hard to do less than 4, but I would say I wouldn't do many more. I think it just complicates your application.
Yeah, and there are attachments that you'll submit with your grants.gov or submit with your application through grants.gov. And I think one of those does specify out, how much you're spending per task. And I think that's the one that it gets a little hard if you have more than 4 tasks. But last year was the first year that I didn't have to submit all the attached forms. So I can't remember from last year how that worked. But I definitely agree with Amanda, keeping it simple, because keep in mind for every task that you have, you will have to have one of those tables that then details out the activities, the schedule, the lead, and that's going to take up a lot of real estate in your application. So keeping it to 4 really helps with spacing for that. All right, any other questions? Did everyone stretch and make sure to keep the blood flowing? All right, let's keep going. So after you talk about your activities and your tasks, you're going to give EPA an idea of your project schedule. So the idea is to convey that you have a plan of action and a timeline for that plan, so you can spend all of the funding that you're going to request within the 3-year time period. So with tight federal budgets, Congress really doesn't like to see money just sitting out there that's obligated but not actually spent. It doesn't really look good for EPA, doesn't look good for the Brownfield program. So EPA really wants to make sure you've thought through a timeline for implementation so the funding can be spent and you can really document those successful accomplishments during the 3-year project period. So here's the ranking and evaluation criteria for this subsection. Basically, it's just like what we said before. What are your milestones and when do you plan on achieving them? And then making sure that this timeline fits within the 3-year project period, that you can expend the funds within those 3 years. That might be a little bit longer for cleanup grants and multipurpose. You might want to just double check the period of performance for those when the new request for applications comes out. So for this section, I thought the best approach was just to give you some examples. So for example, let's say your task is cooperative agreement oversight / exchange program information with EPA and other grantees. You kind of lump those together. So you're going to say, we're going to select our environmental consultant contractor within 3 months of the award, and we're going to submit reports to EPA on a quarterly basis. You know, we'll update acres as project progresses at least monthly. We'll participate in the EPA conferences and calls as scheduled, and update our quality management plan annually. So it has specifically what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. Examples for community outreach. You know, you're going to conduct quarterly community outreach events throughout the 3-year grant period to make sure you're noting. We're going to do that throughout the entire 3 years. Maybe you're going to send out a brownfield newsletter on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, semi-annual, whatever works for you. You can also say we're going to hold the initial grant coalition within 2 months of the award and quarterly thereafter. I think in my grant proposal, we said we're going to host the initial coalition meeting within the first 2 months and then develop a schedule with the coalition for the 3-year period. So you can do that as well and say, this is our plan for that implementation. For your environmental assessment tasks, you know, you definitely want to know when you're going to do, what you're going to do within at least the first year. So you can say, we're going to conduct 3 phase 1s and 2 phase 2s within year 1. And then we're going to conduct an additional 3 phase 1s and 3 phase 2s by the end of the project period. So you want to document what you're going to do early on, and then what you're going to do overall. They really want to see that you're going to be doing some environmental assessments within that first year of your project period. So continuing our table example, here's what you could add in for the schedule for the community outreach task. So like we mentioned before, the quarterly outreach meetings in the target area throughout the project period, weekly social media posts while the projects are underway, and then semi-annual coalition meetings. So that's a way you can relate it back up. And I know I'm repeating some of the information, but like I said, every point counts. So if they ask for it in 2 sections, you can note it in 2 sections. If you need a little bit of space, you can always delete the timelines out of the I section up above and just keep it in the schedule section. But if you have the space, I'd put it in both just to reiterate that process. Let's see, Amanda, would you like to go over your approach to this section?
Sure. I thought I would share the timeline that Oklahoma City usually uses with our grants. So the grants are awarded on October 1, but you find out that you've received them before then. And so during that period before then, you are negotiating your cooperative agreement. And so I usually put from August to October is when I am managing negotiating my cooperative agreement. I also am pretty proactive, and so I select my consultants before I get the grant, because you know you're getting it, but you haven't gotten it. So I will say that from September to October is when I select my consultants. We do a generic quality assurance project plan. It's different for every program, but once my contractor is on board, I give them a month to get that in place. Obtain access agreements, because we do multiple assessments. And so we start in November and it is ongoing. Participate in community outreach forums and verify site eligibility is from December ongoing. So you can see that I've given myself some time to advertise for our consultant select to complete the quality assurance project plan, because you can't do any work without an approved quality assurance project plan. Obtain access agreements, like get my outreach going, conduct phase ones. I usually will say that that'll start in January. By phase ones typically take about a month, and you'll typically need a phase one to determine if you need a phase two. So I probably won't start a phase two until February. And then preparing focused use-based cleanup plans. Let's say I did a phase two in February, was my first phase two. It'll probably be July before I can get to the point of doing a cleanup plan. And then you'll see that all assessment activities complete and cleanup plans in place by August of 22. So if my grant had started in October of 2019, 20, 21, 22, that's 3 years. So you can see a very thought through timeline of the way our program works. I just wanted to give you examples of timelines I've used.
Yeah, and I especially like that she noted like all the assessment activities are going to be complete and the cleanup plans are going to be in place by the end of the project period, like making sure EPA clearly understands that there's a timeline for this and you plan on having everything done before the grant ends. I think that that's really important.
Amanda, was this just a community-wide assessment grant?
So, yes, so this was included in my 2008, the grant application I wrote in 2018 for the FY 2019. And so at that particular time, this was the formatting that they requested it in. The 2020, FY 220 that came out last year requested it in a different format, but it's still the same information. I would just put it in the new requested format. So yeah, this was actually pulled from one of our grant applications, and we were this was pulled from a successful grant application that we were awarded in 2018. We started in 2019.
Well, and I think this is a good way to kind of think through your process of your program overall, to make sure that you kind of have an idea of, like Amanda mentioned, she's going to start her phase one assessments in January. She'll get those results back and then be able to start phase two assessments in February, and then get those results back to do the cleanup plan. So I think doing this process kind of helps you think through the steps in order to help you figure out your timeline to then incorporate into the new EPA RFA format for the table.
And I think too, it also tells your reviewer that you understand that you can't start you typically would not be starting a phase two day one. You're not going to start a phase one day one until you have other things in place, and that you understand these other things must be in place before you can start. So it's kind of a way of saying, yes, I understand the way these work. These are my goals. And when again, everything that is in your application will then be coordinated to your work plan. And so they will turn into milestones that your project officer expects you to meet.
Yeah, and this was the format from 2 years ago that Amanda used, but I think it's a good way of helping you think through. And then you want to make sure, though, to translate this into the new format that EPA is asking for now. But it's a great way to think it through. All right. Thanks, Amanda.
Okay.
All right. Let's see if I can page down. There we go. Okay. So the next category down is the task activity leads. So basically, this is the who's going to do what section. You don't need a lot of detail in this. You just want to list out who's in charge of each task. You want to make sure at least to note the entity, and if you can, the specific job title of the person responsible for each task activity. I wouldn't recommend including specific names, because EPA can then question, okay, what if that specific person leaves within the year between when you apply and when you get the funding? But including a job title, that might be a good idea. And just note that if you do plan on applying for the health monitoring activities, you want to make sure that you note in the section the degree to which your local health agency is involved in that process. So your task activity lead, this can be as simple as just the name of your entity. If you're noting that you're going to do it, it doesn't hurt to remind the reviewer that you're the applicant, just to make sure that they connect you to the grant. Remember, they're reviewing about a dozen of these. So just reminding them, you know, if you're the city of Houdat that's applying, put in parentheses afterwards that you're the applicant. You can also list the specific job title, like the brownfield coordinator or a financial director or the economic development specialist, you know, whoever at your organization might be over the grant. This helps you know specifically who's going to do what. But if you can't do that right now, don't worry about it. Just put, you know, the city of Houdat, and that's fine. For some tasks, it might be a coalition partner or a community partner that takes the lead. So you'll want to note that here. Just make sure that these people are also mentioned in other places in your application. So obviously, if it's a coalition partner, they're mentioned in that first part where you're outlining who your coalition partners are. If it's a community partner, they're noted in the community partner section about their specific role. Make sure all that correlates. Some entities hire a qualified environmental professional to manage their brownfield program. Especially the smaller local governments might not have the capacity to really oversee a brownfield program. So they'll hire a qualified environmental professional to do that. They can do everything from just overseeing the assessment work to completing all the EPA reporting, you know, conducting outreach, coordinating with DEQ, the full gamut. So if you need help working out what your agency can handle versus what you might want to contract out for, please feel free to give Scott and I a call about this and we can talk about that more. But if you're going to hire a qualified environmental professional, you know, you can note them as your task lead in this section. You're probably going to want to hire an environmental consultant to actually perform the environmental assessment work and actually develop the cleanup plans. They'll have the expertise needed to actually ensure that the regulatory requirements are met. So for the environmental assessment task, you might list the task lead as the environmental consultant with the city of Houdat's oversight, just to make sure that they know that you're still involved. You could also do that for the qualified environmental professional. Do the same thing, qualified environmental professional with city of Houdat's oversight, so that they know that you're still involved. So again, keep it very simple for this. And both for the qualified environmental professional and the environmental consultant, make sure that we'll talk about this more in the next webinar, but EPA requires that there is some type of competitive selection process for those two positions. So if you're going to hire a consultant to do any work, you do have to note that you're going to go through a competitive selection process for it. So just kind of a bookmark for that for the next webinar. Okay, and one of the tips for this section, it is okay to have the same lead on multiple activities. So the city of Houdat could be the lead on all the activities. That is completely okay. Most of the time it's the applicant is the lead on most of the activities. So don't worry about that if it's the same person for all of them. All right, so continuing our table example, 3, we're gonna put for the community outreach task, it's gonna be the city of Houdat, who's our applicant, and their brownfield coordinator is gonna be the lead on this. So again, very simple. All right, Amanda, would you like to go over your example?
Yeah, again, last year's application requested that these be in a table, but there's a lot of information that's asked in these sections. This is what my 2018, when it said task activity leads, the tasks are led by city staff along with selected consultants. Details of staffing and staff qualifications are contained in a different section. So all of that requested information was summed up in 2 sentences. Again, this year they're asking for it in a different format, and I'll get to that later, but it can be as simple as this. So again, you're limited on space, so you have to find ways to like get right to the point and keep it simple. So that's what we put. And like I said, that our application was selected.
Yeah, definitely keep it simple, you know, clear, check the box, and then move on. All right. Now we're going to go over the last part of the table where you're going to include your outputs. So basically, this is how you're actually going to document the activities that you listed underneath each task. So what are you going to be able to show to show to how you spent this funding? So typical outputs for assessment grants include, but are not limited to, things like quarterly reports, enhanced site inventories, your phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessment reports, your actual cleanup plans, your area-wide plan, documenting community meetings through agendas or summaries or photos, some additional, those are kind of the outputs that are related to this. So Amanda, do you want to go over your outputs versus outcomes, just so everyone's kind of clear on that?
Sure. Okay, so I'll just describe outputs are things that will happen within the grant period. You will do quarterly reports within the grant period. You will do, you will add your sites to your brownfield inventory. You will have phase 1 assessment reports. You'll have phase 2 assessment reports. You'll have cleanup plans, and you'll have community meetings. Those are outputs. Outcomes are things that typically happen after you've closed out your grants. And so those will be, you know, once you've assessed the property and you've cleaned it up, how many jobs were created. Once the property has been redeveloped, how much funding was leveraged, how many acres were ready for reuse, and how much green space did you create. So I like to describe the difference between outputs and outcomes. As outputs are things that happen within the grant period that you're responsible to report on. Outcomes, you're also responsible to report on them in acres, but those are typically things that will happen once your grant is closed out, and it takes more time for those things to happen. These should coordinate with section 1BII, outcomes and benefits of reuse strategy. So they should, everything in your grant, like everything in your application, will tie together.
Yeah, so you just want to make sure this section, we're talking about the outputs, like Amanda mentioned, you know, what are you actually going to accomplish during the project period? And in other parts of your application, you'll talk about the outcomes, which is what are the results of what the work that you're doing now, what does that spur in the future? Okay, so going along with our table example, some of the outputs for your community outreach could be your agendas from quarterly community meetings and semi-annual coalition meetings, and you're putting summaries of those meetings and social media posts in your quarterly report to EPA. So the outputs are really like, what are your deliverables to EPA that you're going to send into them to actually document what you're doing with this funding? And basically, if someone said, came to EPA and said, you gave this person $300,000, what do they have to show for it? Here's all, this is all the stuff that EPA can send to them to say, here's all the documentation to document what they did, what they said they were going to do. All right, so your next steps for the rest of the table section, you want to note an anticipated project schedule for each task and activity. You know, combine activity timelines as necessary for space. You might be able to cut things out or move things around. You want to make sure to note a task lead for each task, and then note your outputs for the activities noted. Okay, so if you have been with us throughout the entire webinar series, it's not going to surprise you at this point that I use a table to help me organize this section. So you can also use a bullet point list, or you can just jump in and write the tables, you know, whatever works for you. But if you are like me and you like a good table, here's one way to organize the information for this section and kind of think through the various activities, the schedule, the task lead, and the outputs. Note that for the narrative, you might combine some of this information or compress it depending on how much space you have. Personally, I normally start off with listing out my activities, and then I group them into tasks, which makes it easy in Excel because I can just copy and paste each row. And then I kind of move them around until they fit together and then kind of flow well with the story of my application. So for instance, you know, I'm thinking through, okay, I've got to procure quality of a QEP to actually oversee the grant. We're going to do that within 3 months of the award. The city of Houdat, the applicant, we're going to be the lead on that. And what's our output from that? We're going to note, you know, our selection process in the quarterly report to EPA. So kind of just thinking it through. And just FYI, this is just my way of organizing it for planning purposes. This is not something that actually goes into the proposal. It just kind of helps me make sure that I list out all my activities and keep track of them all. So Amanda, do you want to go over your example?
Sure. I want to tell a funny story before I get into this. So when Rebecca contacted me about assisting with this webinar, I was like, of course, I'd love to help. I apply almost every year. And then just, you know, let me know, I'm in. I'll help with whatever you need. So as we were getting close to it, I was going through and using my latest grant application as examples. And as we started looking, I didn't apply last year because we weren't in a position to apply. And it was pointed out to me that they had made a lot of changes in the format of the application. And this is something that EPA does almost every year. Mm-hmm. They will change where they ask for things, how they ask for things. The purpose of this is to make sure that you're not just dusting off last year's application and resubmitting it. So they'll ask for things in just different areas. So pay attention to the way they ask for them. So you'll see here, this is my example from FY 2019. They asked for a project implementation. They asked for my task 1, which we've already gone through. You know, like I said, I list things under programmatic support. And under my programmatic support back in 2019, we had to separate hazardous and petroleum. We don't have to do that anymore. My understanding is this year we're not going to have to separate. You can see my description of programmatic support, right? You can see my description when they ask for your timeline. This is how I did it in FY 2019. You can see that they also ask for task activity leads, and that's how I did it. So all of that information now translates to this is the new format. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can we go down?
Let me go back. Okay, so this is from 2019. Go to the next slide. This is also from 2019, my project timeline, my task activity lead. Again, this is what I used in 2019. Now go to the next slide. And this is how they asked for it last year. Same information, just in a different format, right? Let's see.
Uh-oh.
So this was a requested format for FY 2020. We'll want to watch and see how it is in the new application. You need to pay attention to these things. But if I took the information that I did in FY 2019 and applied it to the FY 2020, that same information that was previously shown would look like this. Under programmatic support, I would put that I'm putting $10,500 in, but that's just me. You don't have to do that. But you can see I put project implementation. City staff are now engaged in community outreach and negotiation of site access agreements and can initiate project activities upon issuance of cooperative agreement, blah, blah, blah. Anticipated project schedule. So what I did is I went up to that project schedule and pulled the things out that were related to programmatic support, task activity lead, city staff, and outputs 12 quarterly reports, 3 training events. So I just wanted to show you Same information asked in a different format. So this is how I would have applied last year.
Yeah, and I especially like how with the output, you know, it's very clear. It's 12 quarterly reports, 3 training events. Like giving those numbers to it, I think really helps beef up your application.
And you'll see that these 12 quarterly reports then tie to the next section in my budget. It's all very consistent.
And that's where the review from KSU tab can really help, is make sure that it is consistent throughout the application. Because I find, you know, we got to tweak this here and tweak that here, and it's hard to keep track of everything. But having that outside reviewer from KSU tab can kind of help make sure that your numbers match up and everything matches up throughout the whole application. All right, so we're gonna take a break for questions, another little stretch break, just to make sure you're not sitting in one place for too long. So Scott, any questions that we need to answer?
Let's see, I have one here. It says, Amanda, you put 180 hours over a 3-year period for $10,500. Does that include fringe, or are you lumping it together into personnel? I'm guessing we're going to get into that discussion on cost here in a minute.
We will. And you'll also see that I put 10,000. Yeah, we'll get into that in cost. I can break that. I'll break out how that was allocated in the cost section.
As we are on a break, I just wanted to point something out, and this way you speakers can take a little rest. If you don't succeed in a grant application, EPA offers a debrief conference call to see, you know, how you might improve it for next time. I've participated in a couple of these now for Louisiana communities. You know, I know Rebecca's being kind of very picky here about not losing any points. But for example, last year, there were 150 points possible on assessments for the grants. I just had a debrief with the community. They scored 142 out of 150, and that was not good enough. So when she says every little point matters, she's not kidding there. It's all important, and even if you think you're being kind of redundant, having to list things in 2 places, follow those directions.
Yeah, it's really important, really tight competition. All right, was there one more question that came in, or are we good?
Somebody likes the Star Wars pictures.
We're going with the theme this time. And I like that someone knew it was Star Wars. All right. So following up on the question that was just asked, we're going to move on to the next section, which is developing your cost estimates and your grant budget. As we noted in the first webinar, and as Amanda just mentioned, EPA used to require that grant funding be separated out into funding to address hazardous contamination and sites with petroleum contamination. Complicated reasons, but good news is you don't have to do that anymore. So when you're looking at the previous RFA or previous successful applications, you can ignore separating out your grant budget by hazardous versus petroleum, which makes things a whole lot easier on all of us. And Amanda, do you have a tip for us on how much money to apply for?
Yes, do not ask for more money than you need. If you have 5 sites, for example, or if you have, let's say you have 1 site or 3 sites or 5 sites, then you probably don't need $300,000, depending on how big your site is. And so EPA gets very frustrated when you're not using your money, because it's money that's sitting there that could be going to other projects and other uses. So make sure that you are realistic about the projects that you have, the abilities that you have, and if you only need 100,000, then only request 100,000. It's frowned upon. Oh yeah, you'll get kind of blackballed if you return money to EPA. Every grant application will ask you if you ever had to return money to EPA. You don't want to be in a position to return money to EPA.
Yeah, I try to spend every dime.
And just make sure you're not asking for more than you can spend.
Yeah. All right. All right. So before we really get into the budget part of it, we're kind of going to go over administrative costs versus programmatic costs. So one of the changes with the Brownfield Act, the Build Act in 2018 that reauthorized the Brownfield program, one of the changes that they did was to allow applicants to use up to 5% of the total amount of the EPA funds you're requesting for administrative costs. Okay, here's the caveat. This is Rebecca's interpretation of what that means. If you want really specifics, you can contact EPA for guidance, but my interpretation is administrative costs are better known as what we call indirect costs or operational costs. So it's things that you need to pay for in order to operate your organization, but aren't directly related to the grant activities. So it's things like, you know, rent for your office space, the cost of utilities or broadband for your office space, you know, accounting staff that keeps all of your entity's financials in order, anything where the costs kind of get spread over multiple sources of income for your entity. So it's more, you know, kind of the general operating costs. And those, so currently, previously these were not allowed to be billed to the grant. And like I mentioned with the Build Act, they did say that you can request up to 5% of your grant funding to go towards the administrative costs. But Amanda has a tip for you on this.
So if you think about it, let's assume you were asking for a combined maximum amount of $300,000 for an assessment grant. 5% of that is going to be $15,000, which is a lot of money. I have not requested this money primarily because the cost of tracking it, like when you consider the expense of your staff and tracking that cost, outweighs the value of that $15,000, in my opinion. And we'll evaluate this on a yearly basis, but I don't request administrative costs because I feel like the expense of tracking that is not worth the value of the money. The decision you have to make, but that's, I mean, $300,000, all you're getting is $15,000 to go towards that. So if you can avoid having to do that, then that's my suggestion. That's the way I view it.
Yeah, and I think this was, if you are a governmental entity, like a local government, state government, something like that, I would agree with Amanda, because normally that's all built in. You have tax revenue to cover that. It's really hard to break it out. If you are, you know, maybe a smaller nonprofit that might need money to help cover some of those costs, you might think about applying for this. Or if you're, you know, some type of entity where you're totally grant funded, you might want to look into these costs. But really do think about it, like Amanda mentioned. Is it really worth it for the amount of time and energy it might take to track the costs and document them? But just make sure that your administrative costs are not the same as programmatic costs. So your programmatic costs include in anything that's directly related to administering the Brownfield grant activities. So you're going to include these costs and your grant budget under personnel, supplies, contractual, et cetera, as applicable, and they are not subject to the 5% limit. So examples of your programmatic costs include, you know, the personnel time to complete quarterly reports or enter information into acres, or costs associated with conducting and overseeing environmental assessments that are paid for by the grant. You know, any of your grant related travel, your training, your equipment, supplies, those are all underneath your programmatic, underneath the programmatic capability. Any costs related to grant specific outreach, or things like maintaining a Brownfield project website or social media. You know, anything that you can say, this is directly related to this grant, that's a programmatic cost that you're going to include in your budget, and there's no cap on that. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, put it in the chat box and we can go over it in a little bit more detail, but just wanted to make sure that that was kind of clear, since that was something new within the last couple of years. So as Amanda showed before, This is going to be the section. This section is going to be your budget table, followed by a description of how you got those numbers. So this is the table that EPA actually gives you in the RFA. So like we mentioned before, if EPA gives you an example, we encourage you to use it. So across the top, you're going to want to fill in any tasks to match up with your task descriptions above. So we've done that with a couple of them for you. For each task, you're going to want to note the personnel. This is the funding to cover staff salary that's directly related to the grant. So for instance, your staff salary time for writing quarterly reports, conducting community outreach, overseeing assessments, that type of thing. You can also include fringe benefits. This is normally calculated as a percentage of your personnel costs, and it covers things like for the person that's billing to the grant for their annual and sick leave, health insurance, and whatever other benefits are specific to the person billing to the grant. You check with your financial folks. They probably know your fringe benefit rate if you don't know it already. Travel includes hotel, flight, other travel costs to attend brownfields related training and conferences and workshops. Like we mentioned before, the regional meeting, once we have it in person again, and the National Brownfield Conference, which I'm sure we're all going to go to in Oklahoma City in April. This can also include mileage to travel to sites for site visits, or mileage costs to go attend outreach events, that type of thing. You can put that here. Equipment is also an eligible expense, but note that EPA defines equipment as items that cost $5,000 or more with a useful life of more than 1 year. Anything less than $5,000, EPA considers supplies. Generally, equipment is not really part of a brownfield grant application. I don't know of too many instances where people have actually purchased equipment that's more than $5,000 with brownfield funding. Supplies can include things like, brochures to market your brownfield program, the cost of hosting a brownfield website, outreach event materials, pens, paper, stuff like that that you need to actually implement your brownfield site. You want to make sure when you're describing what you're putting in the supply section that you really explain what supplies you're asking for funding for and how they relate to the brownfield program if it's not already obvious. And I got to be honest, the supply section is a really good place to kind of add and subtract a little bit of funding here and there to make sure you even out your grant budget. I have found because fringe benefits as a percentage of personnel, you kind of end up with wonky numbers like, $52 left over. Supplies can be a good category to put that funding into. Contractual costs is anything that you're going to issue a contract for, such as your qualified environmental professional, if you're going to hire one to oversee your program, or your environmental consultant that's actually going to conduct your environmental site assessments, or if you're going to hire a consultant to help with executing outreach or with any of your planning activities. This is typically where most of the budget ends up. Most of the money is going to end up for hiring an environmental consultant to do the environmental investigations at your priority site. So you really want to make sure that this is a good chunk of the funding. The other isn't really a widely used category for brownfields, but it could include things like meeting room costs or agreements or contracts with other governmental entities to help with grant activities. Or, in previous years, we've put, if we're doing public notices for our cleanup plans, we put it in the other category. Sometimes though, EPA wants to see this under supplies. Instead, it kind of goes back and forth. If you put anything in this category, make sure, again, list out exactly what you plan on doing with the funding to make sure that EPA knows that it's an eligible cost underneath the grant. And if you have questions about, should I put it here or should I put it there, definitely talk with EPA or KSU first, just to make sure, should it go here or should it maybe go in one of the other categories? You kind of want to use the other categories sparingly. if you need to. And the budget table from last year had in parentheses, include subawards. I actually talked to EPA about this because I'm like, I don't know how that works with assessment grants. And they basically said most assessment grants don't have any subawards. What people think of a subaward, you should actually put in the contractual. So let's say if you're doing a contract with someone to execute part of the workload, that should go in contractual instead of subaward. So just kind of note that. I would not include anything in other unless you really feel a strong desire to, but most likely what you're thinking of putting here would probably apply in one of the other categories, and that would make it easier. All right, so once you have all those direct costs together, you're gonna add those up, and those are your total direct costs. Then if you are deciding to add in your indirect costs, you want to add them here. Normally, most of the agencies that I know, they calculate their indirect costs as a percentage of the personnel costs or your personnel plus your fringe amount. As I mentioned on the last slide, my interpretation is that the indirect costs are the same as administrative costs and include things like rent, utilities, shared clerical staff, all of that thing that has that 5% cap on it. If you have questions on this, you might want to check with EPA to see what to include where and make sure that you're within that 5% cap. All right, then you're going to add up your total direct costs with your indirect costs to get your total budget. And then this number in the bottom right-hand corner should match up with the total amount that you're requesting. Just note at the bottom, the 2 footnotes that I added at the bottom, what I do to save a little space is add those footnotes to say how we calculated the fringe benefit rate and the indirect cost rate. So that way I don't have to explain it in the next section in each section later on when we go through each task. That's just kind of a recommendation. If you really need space, maybe add it at the footnote. Obviously, if you can put it in both places, that's always best, but just kind of a little mini tip there. And then Amanda, do you have a tip for us for the budget table?
I do. So one thing that I found out, I put money in every category. Like I said, I don't do indirect costs, but every category except equipment, because equipment doesn't make sense. It doesn't really fit with this assessment. It hasn't fit with any of the assessment applications I've used, but I always like to include money in other and contractual supplies, travel, fringe, and personnel. The reason being, if you put 0, let's just use the other category. If you put 0 in other and you're working through your, you work through your work plan and it has 0 budget, and all of a sudden you have something that would fall under the other category. If you put 0 in, you cannot move money into that category. And so like if you didn't include that budget in when you start your grant, you can't go, oh, can I move some personnel cost or whatever into the other section? You can't do it. So I suggest you, even if it's $100, put some money in all of the cost categories except equipment. I don't suggest that one, but in personnel, put money in fringe, put money in equipment, put money in supply, or sorry, not equipment, put money in personnel, put money in fringe benefits, put money in travel, put money in supplies, put money in contractual, put money in other. That way, if during that 3 years you need it, you can ask for a budget adjustment and get money into that. So just, that's a helpful tip that I've run into because I have put 0 in, needed some money, and I can't make that budget request because I didn't have an amount in that budget to begin with.
Yeah, we've found that as well. We put at least a little bit for personnel in every task. Just as she mentioned, you can always move it out, but it's harder to move it in if there isn't any budget there to start with. All right. So note that if you are applying for a multi-purpose or a cleanup grant, both of those budgets have special considerations, including the cost share requirement. So if you plan on applying for either of those grant opportunities, make sure you read through the RFA and really understand what EPA is asking for to include in the budget, and follow the example budget that they're giving you in those RFAs. And again, you can contact me or Scott or EPA if you have any questions on that and how to put it together. Okay, so let's talk about the writing approach and what EPA is asking for this section, now that we've kind of gone over the basics. So note for this section, only the evaluation criteria has the subsection numbers. I know we've highlighted that before. Let's see if I can annotate this without getting it too screwed up. All right, so notice like right here, it has the 3BI. They're only in the evaluation criteria, so you don't really need those in the in your actual application. This is one exception to that rule, because it's kind of built into the way that you're actually going to explain or put this section together. So note, you're going to be evaluated on how you come up with the budget numbers, how your budget relates to your proposed tasks and activities, and how much of your budget is actually allocated for environmental site assessment. So note, they specifically state that where budgets where at least 50% of the funds are allocated to site assessments are going to be reviewed more favorably. It's a little unclear on the points system. If you get more points, if you're like at 80% versus 55%, but you definitely want at least 50% of your funding towards phase 2s. I've personally heard like 75 to 80% is a good goal to aim for that amount of funding allocated to your environmental assessment. What the evaluation criteria doesn't say is that EPA is also going to judge you on whether or not all the numbers add up. So make sure you pull out your calculator, triple check your numbers, have somebody else check your addition before sending it in. Make sure that all the numbers add up. And your budget table should, again, only include the funding that you're requesting. Don't include any of your leverage funding, any of the in-kind. It's only the costs that are covered by the EPA grant. And note that most folks kind of work it out so that they need the full 300,000 or for a single applicant, or need the full 600 for coalition. But as Amanda mentioned, you don't have to ask for the full amount, or you don't have to ask for a round number. Those are just maximums. You can actually ask for less. I think there was one application I saw from last year that it was like $275,452.25. Like they got down to that, and that was their request, and they were able to get funded. Okay, so here's an example of how to show the cost per unit to demonstrate how you came up with your budget. If you have the space, you could include the table like up above, or as another option, what I normally do is condense it down into a sentence fragment like the bullet item at the bottom. So this is one that's for the personnel to actually oversee the grant for task 1. We're estimating that person is going to have 20 hours over the course of the grant at $50 an hour, which is going to end up being $1,000. And then our fringe rate of 50% is going to be $500. So our task budget is $1,500 for this, for the personnel and fringe, which I got to be honest, now that I'm looking at it, that's a little on the low side, FYI, but just as an example. Note, you don't have to include both of these. These are just two ways of how you can present it in the application. So this is an example of how to calculate the costs for the environmental site assessments. Note that the personnel hours might vary depending on how thorough a review your staff actually plans on doing for each assessment. Some folks just kind of, rely on their environmental consultants. They just kind of make sure that it's done and then send it into EPA or LDEQ for review. Other folks, like personally for me, I worked as an environmental consultant, so I allocated more time because I actually read them thoroughly. and gave comments back, and we went through several rounds of comments. So just kind of think, who's actually going to oversee it, and how involved are they going to be, and about how much time are they going to spend on reviewing each report and overseeing that process. So for example, for this one, you know, it might be 5 hours per each phase 1 assessment. We're going to do 6 phase 1 assessments, and you know, $50 an hour for that person, $1,500. You know, 10 hours for each phase 1 for phase 2s. Sorry, we're going to do 3 phase 2s. Again, $50 an hour for $1,500. Oh, sorry, this one's totally messed up. But you get the idea. Calculating out the fringe. And then for the contractual part of it, I would ballpark a phase 1 assessment in Louisiana for about $3,000 to $5,000. It could be more depending on the complexity of the site. And I typically include, there's a requirement for title searches. So I include that in there. So that's kind of the ballpark estimate that I give. Some areas might be less than this. So you might want to provide a little bit of rationale on how you come up with this number. You can say, you know, based on our experience, phase 1 in our city cost, you know, $2,000, or, you know, based on what DEQ told us, our state regulatory agency, they told us they would cost $3,000 to $5,000. So this is how we got up to it. Or, you know, we called 3 local environmental consulting firms familiar with doing a phase 1 in our area, and they told us it was going to cost $4,000 for each phase 1. You know, you want to provide a little rationale of where you got that number from. Phase 2 assessments, these are a little, it really varies. You can have one that's $20,000. You can have one up to $200,000. You know, it kind of depends on the size of the site, the number of environmental concerns at the site, whether you're going through the traditional LDEQ program or if you're going through the voluntary remediation program. There's a lot of variables to this. What I generally use is somewhere between 20 and 40,000. That's kind of the normal range for a phase 2 assessment. And this is where you want to look at what your budget is, because keep in mind, EPA wants to see that you're going to have a good number of sites being assessed. So it kind of looks better, instead of saying we're going to have 1 phase 2 at $90,000. It looks a little better if you're going to do 3 phase 2s at $30,000, you know, for that same $90,000 budget. And again, it's really hard to tell at this phase because you're not going to be doing that phase 2 for another 1.5 years. So it's hard to estimate that cost. But if you're kind of ballpark it, like I said, between $20,000 to $40,000 for a phase 2 assessment, and then work with your budget to make sure that you can have an adequate number of phase 2 assessments and phase 1 to work that out. Okay. All right, so Amanda, do you want to walk us through an example of how you've done it?
Sure. So I do, although the math and the way she figured them are very similar, in my application, this is how I would describe task 1, programmatic support. So you can see on the budget, it says programmatic support instead of task 1, but I'll put task 1, programmatic support. Staff time for programmatic support is estimated at 180 hours to be paid from the assessment grant. Additional salary will be covered with the city's general fund. My portion of my salary is paid out of general fund, and I also have an RLF and a few other funding sources. So making that clear, supplies for each grant is estimated at $500 over 3 years for the computer related hardware, paper, ink, pens, other miscellaneous office supply. A portion of funds will be used to offset costs for travel and education training for staff to attend the National Brownfield Conference or other Brownfields venues. So you can see that I put that in the text, my logic for this, and you'll see that all of this text translates directly down into the budget. So that is my first task, programmatic. That's where that 10,500 went to. Let's go back to my second task, phase 1 and 2 environmental site assessments. The cost assumes that 25 phase 1s will be completed along with 5 phase 2s. The budget assumes an average per site cost of $3,000 to $4,000 for phase 1s and $30,000 to $40,000 for phase 2s. Most of the funds, estimated at $165,000 collectively, is expected to be spent on phase 2s. The reason I put that sentence in there is that in that RFA, there, in that request for assessment for 2019, it specifically said points will be given, or majority of funds would be like, you'll get extra points, or like favored, will be looked upon favorably if a majority of the funds went to phase 2. So I made sure to note that most of my funds are going to be spent on phase 2s. And you can see those dollars. My task 2 in the budget, it's phase 1 and phase 2 ESAs, and you can see $268,288 under contractual. Next example is task 3, focus use-based cleanup planning. After phase, this is like your APCAs. So after phase 2 reports are completed, staff and the consultant will develop a use-based cleanup plan for an estimate of 3 sites. These are estimated to cost between $1,500, I'm sorry, that's supposed to be $2,000 each. Preparation of cleanup plans will be consistent with submittal requirements for Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality or Oklahoma Corporation Commission. So that is my task 3. And you can see that I've included cost for personnel, cost for fringe, and cost for contractual. Task 4 is community involvement. Again, I did 180 hours. It's an estimate. You know, it's hard to estimate what you're going to be doing in a year from now. Additional salary costs will be covered by the general fund. Contracts are expected to support community meetings, and we have included $500 for rental space or other items as needed. So you can see that when you total these all up, that is my budget table, and that is how I described it. I will tell you that always put money in personnel and always put money in fringe. The reason I suggest this is as we're, like my city where we're at right now, our general fund is short because we're paid by sales tax. And so there are a lot of budget adjustments. And so what EPA doesn't want is to see that you have not allocated any money to personnel. They want to see that there's money in personnel and in fringe. Doesn't have to be a lot, so that they are guaranteed that this grant, that somebody will be there to manage this grant, or the funding will be there to pay somebody to manage this grant. My experience typically is I always put money in personnel, I always put money in fringe, and then throughout the process of the grant, I usually end up moving it to contractual because we don't use it all. That's been my experience, but I would definitely say include it so that your reviewer feels confident that you have covered your bases and made sure that this project or this grant can be managed. Again, you'll note that all of my categories, except for equipment, have a dollar amount in them. For once you get the grant, you can move money around. If I need more money in contractual, or if I don't travel, you can request a budget adjustment. That's fine, but just don't leave a zero amount, except for equipment, because I don't know when equipment would be. I can't think of a reason that equipment would be necessary for an assessment grant. So that is word for word how I work through this budget and how I explain my costs.
Yeah, the only thing I could see for equipment, I keep wanting to push to get a drone so that
I
way
do too.
so that we can go into some of these abandoned buildings, into the inside, you know, the ones that you're not quite sure if you should send a person in. But I'm not really sure that EPA would be up for paying for that out of these grants. But I could see that if you want a fancy schmancy drone, because these days they can be less than $5,000. But just that might be an example. But like Amanda said, most grants don't have that equipment line item. All right. So your next steps for this section, you want to draft your budget table in Excel. Keep in mind you only want the costs that are going to be billed to this grant. And then develop your cost estimate. So you want to think about your personnel time, make sure you know how many hours and the hourly rate equals this amount. You want to calculate your fringe and your indirect costs using your rates, because normally those are a percentage of the personnel, and talk to your financial folks, to get those numbers. Make sure you include funding for travel, the annual Region 6 Brownfield meeting in Dallas. I'd still include some money in that, even though, who knows what next year's going to bring. But like Amanda mentioned, if there's money in that travel budget, then you can always move it out later. It's harder to move it in if you don't have it there. Definitely, make sure you note the National Brownfield Conference, which is every 18 to 24 months. I normally estimate going to about 2 of those per the 3-year period. And just note for both of those, that can be your brownfield coordinator, your financial person can go, 2 or 3 people from your organization might be able to go, or if you're doing a coalition, you can also budget money in that for coalition members to apply, 1 person from each of the coalitions to attend those conferences and trainings. Contractual, you want to think through, are you going to actually contract with someone to help with outreach? Definitely make sure to note how many phase 1s and phase 2s, the costs of those, and where did you come up with those numbers, and what are the amounts? And then if you're going to hire a qualified environmental professional, note that amount as well. And then with supplies, make sure you're including a description of that to specifically state, what you're going to spend this funding on. All right. So that brings us to the end of the cost estimate section. Scott, do we have any questions?
We have one lingering. Have you ever seen an EPA debrief that gave kudos points for a city committing in-kind personnel costs instead of including personnel costs in the grant? And as a follow-up, would in-kind personnel costs be considered a leveraged resource?
I'll jump in on that question. Always put money in personnel and always put money in fringe. But like our program, the city does supplement my funding. I do consider that as not lever. Yes, I do consider that in our proposal, but it's just been mentioned to me in the past 10 years that they do get concerned when you don't have any money in personnel or any money in fringe, because they want to make sure that this grant can be managed and it won't basically, like, you won't lose an employee or funding won't go away, and then they're stuck with 300,000 or 150,000 and the project's not done. But like I do, half of my salary is paid by general fund. I note that, but I also include some cost in it. And you don't typically get a debrief if you get the grant. You only get a debrief if you don't get it.
Oh, I've learned the trick. You can actually ask for a debrief both ways.
Really?
So I learned that from another grantee, that she was successful, but she still asked for a debrief because, again, every point counts. So if you do lose points somewhere, you can always find out, make sure that you strengthen the proposal for next time. So just FYI.
That's a helpful tip.
I know. As far as it goes, I think it depends on the reviewer as to whether that they see that as a benefit or not. Whether it's looked on favorably as if the city is willing to put some skin in the game. I think Amanda's approach is good to say, half of our funding is going to be paid for out of the general fund, and then half is going to be out of this grant. You kind of cover both areas. But like I mentioned before, my personnel costs when I was at the Regional Planning Commission were completely out of the grant, and I don't think we were ever docked for that. So I think that was okay. I did have to clearly state why the personnel costs were higher, that I was actually doing a full review as an environmental consultant with an environmental consultant background for it, because they did kind of question why it was so high. But once I started explaining that, they were okay with that amount of salary personnel and fringe going to it. As far as if it would be considered a leveraged funding, so if you are saying it's for the brownfield coordinator to oversee this grant funding, then you're going to include it in this section with your cost estimate and the overall task description section. So you're going to include it in this section 3. You're not going to include it then in the leverage resource section back up in section 1. Again, you don't want to double dip. And since it is something that's integral to the execution of this grant, that belongs in this section, in section 3, and not as a leveraged resource, which you're going to note, I think it's in section 1. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions?
No more in the chat, no.
Okay. All right. All right, 3C. This is measuring environmental results. So in this section, you're going to tell EPA how you plan to track your progress, track your projects, and track your outcomes of your brownfield program. So here's the ranking and evaluation criteria. Note that you're going to need to track, measure, and evaluate. First of all, your project output. So those are the deliverables that we talked about before that you're going to note in the tables up above. Your overall project results. So what did those outputs actually accomplish during the project period? And your eventual project outcomes. So like as Amanda mentioned before, what are some things that you're going to see later on outside of this project period? So for instance, once the assessment was complete, a bank then was able to loan the developer $10 million towards the redevelopment. So that's something of an example of the outcome. So you want to think through how you plan on tracking your site after the grant period to continue to report on the progress. Because a lot of the times, the leveraged resources, the jobs created, the acres ready for reuse, those aren't going to really come into play during your project period. They're going to be after your project period. So you want to make sure you're communicating to EPA that you plan to not only document your success during the 3-year grant period, but how you're going to continue to monitor those projects afterwards. Again, that information just really helps promote the program, show the success of the program, and why it should continue to be funded. You want to notice that you're going to be evaluated on how you correlate the information in this section with the information previously presented in the application. So both in your description of your project, as well as the tables that we just went through for your tasks and activities. So EPA wants to know how you plan to keep track of your projects and your deliverables to make sure that the program is moving along as it should. I'm going to be honest, this isn't, you don't need a lot of description in this section. You just kind of need to communicate what's your plan for tracking progress. So there are different ways of doing this. One of the ways I do it, I have an Excel spreadsheet that tracks my project progression and some of the key deliverables. It has, across the top, I list all the projects that we currently have open. And then down the side, it has things like, when did I submit the property eligibility determination request to EPA? When did they submit the phase 1 report? When are we doing the site visit? Things like that. So you can just say, we have a spreadsheet to track our project progression and make sure that things are on track. You could also mention in this section, you're going to use the KSU tab Brownfield Inventory tool. That's something that, EPA is supporting that program. So they do like to see when grantees are using the tools that they've already paid for. So you can also say, we're going to track the projects through the Brownfield Inventory tool. And just FYI, you can actually export that information into EPA acres as well. So that helps. You could also mention this section. You're going to regularly report to EPA and quarterly reports. And you can say for outreach events in our quarterly reports, we're going to tell you how many people came, what type of event it was, give you a summary, and then note any outcomes. You can talk about that a little bit here. You could also note you're going to regularly update acres. Like I said, very important to EPA, including after the grant has closed out. Like I mentioned before, a lot of the outcomes happen after the grant. So you just want to make sure you're going to include your leverage resources and your jobs created even after the grant is ended, and make sure you're keeping acres up to date. You could also enter in here if you're going to do any kind of financial tracking software that you might have, just kind of mention it here. We use, XYZ program to track our grant expenses and make sure that each grant budget is allocated appropriately. You could also talk about in the section that you're going to have internal or coalition and or community check-in meetings, on whatever basis, a monthly, quarterly, semi-annual basis, to evaluate progress and plan things moving forward. So these are just kind of, some examples that you can include in this section. So just kind of think through, keep it simple, have enough detail to cover your bases, but kind of think through how you're actually going to track your project throughout the 3-year period. All right, Amanda, do you have an example for this section?
Sure. So this is what we've used in our grant applications. The City of Oklahoma City enters environmental site assessments into acres, of course, and a GIS brownfield database to track progress. Brownfield staff routinely attend community meetings, which will be tracked and noted in quarterly reports. The city will track jobs created and document the reuse of sites as they progress. The assessment grants will minimize exposure to contaminants by identifying what sites have contamination and assisting with cleanup planning to remediate/mitigate the sites and prepare them for reuse. Expected outcomes are listed in the chart. So my outcomes include the jobs that outcomes include jobs created, my funding leveraged, ready for reuse and green space. And then again, my outputs are, I have both. So that's what I've included in the past.
Yeah, and again, it's not a big section, but you just kind of need to know that you have a plan in place to actually track things and how you're going to do that, and you have a plan for moving forward, just so EPA is clear about that. All right, so your next steps for this section, just kind of, develop your plan for measuring results. Think about if you're going to use the KSU tab bit, you're going to use a spreadsheet, maybe Microsoft Access. You've got a project whiteboard that you put everything on, whatever it is that you use to track your project. You kind of want to note that you're going to be submitting quarterly reports and include what information you'll include in those. I would definitely mention acres. And then you can also include things like, whatever check-in meetings you plan to have or financial tracking, things like that. All right. So we have made it through this one. We came in on time. So that is that's the presentation for today. We're going to have a final pause for questions, and then we've got a couple more like general tips, and then we'll talk about the upcoming webinars. So Scott, are there any other questions we need to go over?
Just received one. Is the funding leveraged portion of outcomes separate from the earlier section in funding leverage? A portion, i.e. only the leverage funding that happened after the grant or the whole number?
So those would be the same. Are you talking? Let's go back up. Let me go back up to her example. And we're going to use the new okay, let's see if this works. All right, so this funding leveraged here, where it says the 142 million, that is the same as what you stated earlier in section 1. So those would be the same numbers that you're putting in both places, because this will include things like, you know, the purchase price of the property, or the cost of actual remediation once you've done the assessment work, or the cost to actually redevelop the site. You know, that's all going to be included in here. So that is the same as what you mentioned before.
And I just want to point out on that section that if I went back up to the section on leveraging resources, that I broke it down to like the new Oklahoma City School, that we had 16.6 million designated to fund out of, so we had a pot of 16.6 million. The LCDA, or the Humane Society, they had a cost estimate of fundraising that they were doing. So those are the things I counted up, and you will see that this funding leverage of 142 million ties to my earlier section.
Okay. Any other questions, Scott?
Nope.
Okay. One of the things that Amanda and I wanted to just talk about for here, just as an FYI, I know I mentioned earlier that you can't double dip with funding sources. So let's say you have a project in your small town of Houdat, Louisiana, that you want funding for and you're planning on applying for, but you're not sure you're going to be successful with this. You know, you might also want to contact maybe your parish entity or your metropolitan planning organization and see if they're planning on applying for brownfield funding. And you could include that site within their applications as well. So that way, you know, if you don't get funded, but your parish does, you know, now you have funding for the site. So that's one way, you know, if it really is an important site and you want to have your best chance of getting funding, you can include it in multiple places. What you can't do is if the parish has already received funding to do environmental assessment work on that site, then you can't apply for funding for it as well, unless you need additional resources for it. So hopefully that makes sense. So just as a thought process, FYI, LDEQ is planning on applying for assessment funding this year. So if you have a site that, you know, is really a high priority for you, and you're not sure, you know, if you're going to be successful or not in this application, you know, send the site in to me, and we might be able to apply for that site as well. And then if you get funding, you know, we'll just spend that money on a different site. So just kind of keep that in mind, just in case, you know, just to kind of hedge your bets and make sure you have the funding for the sites in your area. All right, Scott, any more questions before we move on to the final tips?
Yes, we have one from Kimberly. Will you be sharing Amanda's successful grant that she wrote that she is referencing in this webinar? That is not one of the ones that KSU has available.
Scott, I'm more than happy to share it with you, and if you want to upload it to your website.
We can do that. Want everybody to keep in mind, as Amanda's mentioned several times, the format, the requirements, the way things are organized have changed since then, but it would be a great example of the information.
I also want to point out that all the winning grants from, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, the grants that were selected to receive funding in last year's through EPA are available for you to review.
Really?
I believe so.
I don't know that it's all of, are you talking about on KSU's website?
No, I'm talking on EPA.
Oh.
These are public, they're public documents available to you. I'll have to look and see where we can get them, but I know that if they are selected by EPA to be funded, that you should be able to get a copy of the winning proposals.
You can with a FOIA request, I know. I didn't know if they just had them all out there in general.
You should ask.
Okay.
All right. So Scott, any more questions?
Yeah, it's request to send an attachment. We can take care of that later.
Okay. All right. So as Amanda and I were putting together this application, Amanda had a couple of really good tips that she had that I wanted to make sure to include. They didn't really fit with the rest of the content, so we're just kind of adding them on the end. So Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit about who should write the application?
Sure. So I manage our program. Grant writing is my least favorite thing to do, but I do write our grants. At least I write the first drafts because I know how our program works. I know where our focus is. Our program lies in our planning department, so I know where we're pushing resources and where we need them. So I definitely suggest that the person managing the program write the grant. Then I suggest once you have written it, my experience has been if they require 10 pages what you write, and as you answer everything, it'll be like 15. So then I suggest that you send it to other people and have them review. If they have a suggestive way of getting your point across in a smaller sentence effectively, then have them do that, but have them do it in a track changes format so you can see what changes they're making. Because we're earning points here and you want to make it easy for your reviewer, and although you might have mentioned it earlier in the grant application, you may have to repeat it further in the grant application. So just make sure that when you have somebody reviewing your grant application, that they review it in a track changes format, because there may be a reason that it was necessary to repeat it because of the grant application. Don't copy and paste from another, don't take mine and copy it into yours. You can tell if if you can copy what I've put and it goes into yours without any adjustment, that's not specific enough. That may look good, but it's not specific enough. This is a nationwide competition. The competition is very stiff. So make sure, review others, but make sure that you tailor it to your program. Let's see. Again, like Rebecca said, if you're a community that has one or two or one project, and you are competing in a national competition, but make sure that your state level also can include it in their application. That way, if you don't get it, you still could get funding from your state. So those are, I'm going to add one extra one in here that wasn't on our list, Rebecca. Also, work out a timeline. As soon as the grant announcement comes out, I always put together, I get a little calendar out and I put due dates in, and this is when I need to have my draft done, and this is when I need to send it out for other reviews, because it is a lot of work. I've done it for 10 years. Every year it is a lot of work, and so if you're not keeping up with these milestones, it'll get down to the last minute and you won't get it done. So I suggest getting that, and you really outside input after you've got your first draft is important. It just takes a lot of time. Okay, that's all.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that. I have been on the receiving end where somebody else wrote the application and then I inherited it. And it was definitely more challenging because I wasn't involved on the front end. I did want to mention, though, in Louisiana, folks have had some success working with a consultant to write the application. They can help with wordsmithing it. I've seen this go really well, and I've seen this go really poorly. So when it goes really well, the consultant works closely with whoever at the entity is actually going to be involved in the project. They work together, like, what is the target area? They get a lot of feedback from the city or the organization that's applying. What do you want to see with this funding? Who are you already involved with? It's very much a collaborative process with that. And that's worked well in several different communities, where they've worked collaboratively together in writing the application. so that the consultant really knows what are the priorities for that organization. I've also seen it where a consultant has come in and just said, you should apply for Brownfield grant, we'll write your application. And they wrote the whole application without involving the entity. And the problem with that was, you know, when it actually came time, when they were awarded, you know, the entity didn't really know what to do with this funding. There was also the impression given that the consultant would then handle managing the grant, which you can't, if someone writes your application, they can't automatically get the work for actually executing it. You do have to do some kind of competitive process. Either you can do that, you know, way ahead of time, and your competitive process is for them to write the grant and then manage it, or you can do it where they, you know, the consultant has written it pro bono, and then once you get the funding, you do a competitive selection process to select who's actually going to implement that. So you can work with it, but you just need to make sure that it is a collaborative process, and you're not just kind of handing it all off to a consultant. So I'm seeing a question from Kimberly. If you work with a consultant to craft your application, can we include those costs in the budget cost estimate? Nope.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
None of your, you can't use your brownfield funding to pay for developing a brownfield grant. So you can't use this funding to pay a consultant to write the grant. That needs to be, it kind of has to be your skin in the game. You need to put that money up in order to get it in the future. So just kind of a couple of extra tips on things to think about when you're putting your proposal together. There's a lot of consultants, you know, they've done this in, you know, day in and day out nationwide. They've got the formula down. But like I said, they still need to work with someone at the organization who's actually going to be applying to make sure they know your target area, what your priorities are, and how, you know, the city or the nonprofit or whatever organization is going to be involved in that process. You don't just want to hand it off and walk away. All right. If there's any questions on that, we'll have an extra little section at the end, but we're just going to keep going through. We're going to go through reviewing our next steps. So again, for section 3A, you want to develop your list or bullet list or however you want to do it of your planned activities. You want to think about what activities you're going to do in your priority site areas or with your target areas. And then think, if applicable, you know, what activities you're going to be doing outside your target area. And then think about, are there any in-kind resources that are necessary to complete that scope of work that you might want to include. You want to group those activities into 3 or 4 tasks, and then note your project schedule for each task activity, as well as your task lead and your outputs. And then section 3B, you want to draft your budget table in Excel. Again, only costs billed to the grant, and then make sure you specifically outline out how you came up with those numbers. And then have somebody double check to make sure those numbers match your budget table and everything adds up correctly. And then for section 3C, you want to develop your plan for actually measuring your results. You know, how are you going to track your projects and the funding for this program? All right, so if you missed the previous webinars, webinars 1 or 2 have been posted on the KSU tab website under ksutab.org/resources. You want to search for 2020 LDEQ. I have been told webinar number 3 is coming soon. So hopefully that will go up in the near future, just in case you missed them. And then we've got 2 more webinars to finish out this series. The next one's going to be on July 30th, which is programmatic capability and past performance. And the next one, it says August. Just note that might actually be early September. We're going to host the last webinar when the new request for application comes out, which is expected to be late August. So once it comes out, we'll host a webinar, probably in coordination with EPA Region 6 and KSU to talk about any of the changes that they've made from the previous request for applications. If you have any contacts related, if you have any questions after the webinars, feel free to contact Scott with KSU Tab. Jennifer Clancy is also with KSU Tab, so she presented on one of our previous webinars. She's still happy to answer questions. Or you can also contact me. Just note right now, email is the best way to reach me while we're still dealing with COVID and stuff. The phone is a little iffy, so just go ahead and email me if you have any questions, and we can connect just to make sure you feel prepared for when the request for applications comes out. All right, so Scott, any other final questions? Or Amanda, do you have any final thoughts?
Nope.
I would say that if you have the ability to, I'm going to second this consultant issue. If you have somebody who is a consultant and enjoys grant writing, after you've written your draft, let's definitely have them look through it. If you can, you cannot spend brownfield funding on that, but if you have another source of funding, or if they're willing to do it in kind, definitely, because there will be key terms, and if they're familiar with it, they can definitely improve your application. So definitely, it is a team effort. Like you guys said, KSU Tab is an amazing resource. They're more than willing to give them time to go through your application. I've used them in the past, and they'll give you suggestions on improvements. So definitely definitely take advantage of the resources that are out there.
Yeah, and a note on if you do plan on sending in your application to KSU Tab for review, just shoot Scott an email and let him know that that's your plan. You can do that today, correct, Scott?
That is correct. Also, we're available to start helping communities right now in organizing things. The RFA is not out, so we don't know exactly what the applications will look like. But we do anticipate a lot of the same, things being in there, and we're happy to get started now helping people gather the things that are necessary for an application. Also, I have unmuted everybody, so if you want something to say, unmute yourselves at your end and jump on in.
Rebecca, I'm going to jump in real quick and just, we are planning the national conference will be held in Oklahoma City. We're very excited about this. So it's scheduled for April of next year. So if you are involved and interested in brownfields, I hope that you include some budget in, or hopefully you can come up with a budget. We won't have these grants by then, but I'd love to meet you in person in next April here in Oklahoma City.
And I think you are taking idea session proposals, correct?
Yes. So if you have ideas, there's a national, or send it to Scott. If you have ideas on projects that you would like to do, the national call for sessions is open, and so is our local one. So send them our way.
All right. All right, well, thank y'all for joining us today. We will talk again in 3 weeks. And like I said, if you have questions in between then, please feel free to contact us, and hopefully we can get some good grants in Louisiana next year. So thank you so much.